Welcome to the Right Now Prizes second virtual fireside chat. I hope it's not echoing for you as it is for me. Thank you for joining us. Many thanks to our special events manager, Janelle.
I'm Randy Fertel, co-founder of the prizes. Our daunting topic today is America's great unsolvable problem, race. For those who are connecting with us for the first time, the Right Now prizes recognize those who persevere in acts of truth-telling that protect the public interest, promote social justice, or illuminate a more just vision of society. The prizes honor my late friend, Ron Ridenour. Ron touched history when he uncovered the My Lai massacre, when 504 Vietnamese villagers, elderly men, women, and children were gunned down. Many lined up in a ditch, a Nazi kind of thing, as one of the perpetrators called it. The Army's official after action report declared My Lai a great American victory. Some very good policing, as it were. The American soldiers wore no body cams that day, but an Army photographer assigned to cover the attack on the village later graphically confirmed Ron's whistleblowing. Together, Ron's letter to the Pentagon and to Congress and the My Lai photos in Life magazine helped change the country's attitude to the war. Later, Ron won a George Polk Award for investigative reporting. He had a passion for the truth, and he had talent, an unstoppable combination. In uncovering the war's worst known atrocity, Ron spoke truth to power. And that's our subject today. As My Lai did, the murders of George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, Amir Locke, and so many others inspired an outpouring of protest, a global reckoning with American violence and racism. Today, we'll discuss the intersection of race and policing, as well as the media's role in covering them. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jarvis Williams, policy analyst for Open the Government. He'll be joined by Cariol Horn, our Truth Telling Award recipient in 2021. Cariol is a police reform activist. Joining them will be Jamie Calvin, our Courage Prize recipient in 2016. Jamie is a writer and the founder of the Invisible Institute. The topic we've set them, this unsolvable problem of race, is daunting, but you'll hear about the momentous actions Cariol and Jamie each took to address it. As the legendary anthropologist Margaret Mead reminded us, we are continually faced with great opportunities which are brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. Once again, thank you for joining us. Jarvis, please take it away.
Thank you, Randy. It's so good to see and be here with you, Jamie and Cariol. I am so excited about the conversation we're about to have. It's so needed. And I think if I could start this way, one of the challenges of our moment is to try to have the conversations that we must have to make better decisions than we have made about problems that we've faced before. And I think race, issues around racism, is at the center of that. But I am excited. I want to start this way. I want to start with bringing in both of your stories. I think that in order to get our hands around the issue of race and this problem we're trying to address, it's important for us to hear stories. It's important for us to hear how people have addressed these issues in their personal lives and the implications of those stories. So, Cariol, I've been a fan of yours, and I have admittedly used and invoked your name in conversations around justice and accountability and courage. Would you be so kind to share with us kind of how your story unfolded and began and what led you to this point now to be a provocative truth teller?
Well, I was a police officer, and I stopped my coworker from choking a black handcuffed man, and I was fired for that. Eventually, that officer did go to jail because he continued to abuse people. Um, and, after that, I tried to figure out a common sense way to help other officers and so that they would not end up like I had been, which was fired. And I wrote a law, Carrio's Law, which I'm trying to get passed nationally. And it also needs a national registry so that an officer can't go from one city to another city or one state to another state, county, or whatever. Um, so it needs a national registry. But I did write that law, and it was passed in Buffalo, New York, in 2020. And in 2021, I um, was given the okay to get my pension, which I haven't received yet, but that's in the works. And that firing was also overturned.
Wow. Wow. Would you mind uh, helping us to get our minds around what provoked you to take such a what I think should have been a human instinct to address something that happens. But I've also been in conversations with other officers and other people who are looking at these issues, and it's a very difficult thing to get people who are watching something unfold, who have certain forms of authority, to challenge someone else who shares the authority. So that's a big deal, right? That's not just that's not easy to do. And so I'm wondering, like, how and what motivated you to just act on good conscience in that moment.
Just like you said, human instinct.
Ah,
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to um, stop something that they see is wrong.
yeah,
Of course, it doesn't happen as often as it should because of that blue wall of silence. But I didn't think of that at the time. What I thought about was he may kill him, and I'm here, so I need to stop him.
wow, wow. It's I know that now people celebrate that response. Specifically when we've seen other responses so dramatized on our film and on our TV sections of other officers who witnessed and watched where things are happening. Um,
Watch
that's
George Floyd being murdered.
absolutely,
You're
absolutely.
actually watching what was called public lynchings before, but now it's on the news, and we watch it over and over again. It's like, how often can you watch it and not respond to it or become numb to it?
Absolutely. Which, and let me ask you, push this, and then maybe Jamie, this will be a segue into you bringing in your story, because I have been a victim of being stopped by police, and I've been, pulled out the car, and I've had them search my car, and one of the things that resonates with me now is that when it happened, there was an officer who had the lights on, he had plain clothes on. So when I pulled over, he comes up and he does, he says his first response was, have you been smoking? What have you been smoking? And then it turns into get out the car. He searches my bag, etc. I'm a college student coming home, so I'm roughly 18 years old. And another officer shows up, and I'm standing behind the car while he's going through my car. I haven't, given him any permission. He hasn't looked at my license. He hasn't looked at any of these other things. And then the other officer starts talking to me about college and basketball and how I feel. And it resonated to me. How is it that you're watching someone do this and you're trying to calm me down? You're trying to get me to forget that I'm being dehumanized, and forget that I'm being insulted and that injustice is happening. But those stories, the ability to see that experience is hard to get at. So as a segue, Jamie, you were able to be in an environment where you witness story upon story upon story. Could you speak to us about how that close proximity to the pain of people gave you a certain perspective that has helped you to do your work, and then of course how you are doing that work now?
Yeah, so I'm speaking to you from the south side of Chicago, and my home. I'm a native. And some years ago, roughly 30
Well, I
years.
guess he will once he comes back on.
What's that?
But in the meantime, we can keep talking
Can you hear me?
about what we can do.
Okay,
Are you not hearing me?
I can hear you, Jamie. Can you, Cario, can you hear Jamie? You can't hear Jamie. Okay.
What about others?
Oh, okay.
She's coming back.
Okay.
Yeah, she'll come back.
Okay.
So really, my practice as a journalist has also been had a great deal to do with this place, the South Side of Chicago, and I live in an integrated enclave, Hyde Park, Kenwood, near the University of Chicago, surrounded by the Black South Side. And the idea that formed for me, close to 30 years ago, was kind of to explore my own home place, and with the idea of sort of what it means to be a neighbor, rather than some more dramatic notion, but what it means to act as a neighbor under conditions of urban apartheid, which I think is an apt description of the sort of hypersegregation on the South Side. So over time, by degrees, I got deeply involved in the high-rise public housing on the South Side of Chicago, on South State Street. State Street being the defining street in Chicago, State Street, that great street, but the residents referred to South State Street as the low end of State Street. And as of the early mid-90s, when I first, got deeply engaged in those communities, it was based on the 1990 census, the biggest concentration of public housing in the country and the biggest concentration of poverty. And I won't go into all the details, but I got more and more and more deeply involved in that setting, and both in kind of neighborly ways and as a writer and reporter. And there were really two defining things about it. One was just the incredible spaces that exist, the distances in urban America within intimate landscapes. So, the public housing high-rises, all now demolished over the last quarter century, were walking distance from my home. You could see them from the library at the University of Chicago. You could see the towers, in the distance. A completely different world in terms of how people were treated by the police, often by the same police officers who would behave in one way in the community where I live, and so radically different in this other community. So I began to report on that. And I thought of it as human rights reporting from the ground, that started not with some abstraction about policing, but with the particular blows to particular bodies administered by particular hands. I did that reporting for years, and a question formed. I'm immersed in this place. I'm a reasonably competent reporter documenting what I'm seeing from day to day. And the question that formed was, how would the world need to be organized? What set of institutional conditions would have to exist for what I'm witnessing from day to day to be the case? So it was like beginning to, from the ground, kind of climbing an analytic ladder. And with some civil rights lawyers and law students at the University of Chicago, we began to bring federal lawsuits based on my reporting, and ultimately brought lawsuits that enabled us through discovery to access information about investigations of citizen complaints of police misconduct. And what became apparent when we began to get this information was just a completely broken system in terms of meaningful accountability. Yeah. And Carrie will know, what I'm talking about. that the officers operating in this public housing setting, which everybody knew was doomed and the buildings were ultimately going to come down, had complete impunity. They want to live off the drug trade, shaking down drug dealers. If you're, as the residents used to say, KKK in blue and white, you just get off on humiliating black folks, wretched behavior towards women. I mean, officers who were bent that way had the freedom, and a lot of that had to do with these dysfunctional oversight agencies. But it also fundamentally, and this, I'll stop with this and we can, move on. It had fundamentally to do with the social status of their victims. We had defined out of existence, in Chicago, we refer to project people who live in public housing.
Right.
The way in which the so-called drug war has been prosecuted, criminalized whole populations.
Right.
So in any test of credibility with officers, so somebody's an officer's framed you, put drugs on you, or otherwise framed you, in court, it's just no contest. The officer has credibility.
Right.
By definition, the
Right.
public housing resident doesn't.
Right.
So that for me has been really, the central work, and the reporting based on that foundation of sources and experience sort of brought me to a couple of other junctures that we can talk about more. The big case in Chicago was the murder of Laquan McDonald by the police. And I broke that story, but I broke it both because of this context I had that enabled me to recognize something, but also, and this goes to Carrie Old's heroism, it was somebody within law enforcement who reached out to me and said, that shooting last week, it was not at all what was reported. There's dash cam video there, and that's what set me off reporting.
Well, so let me that's a great segue, because Carrie, what I want, can you hear me? Let me clarify. Carrie, can you hear me good? Okay, awesome.
Yes.
I want you to pick up on this point. One of the challenges when you work with communities of color, specifically in my context, African Americans, is the distrust in police. And for this purpose, because the stories that they tell about us are not the realities that we're experiencing. So that the credibility of the officer will always outweigh the credibility of a child. So for instance, when I got stopped, no one would believe this 18-year-old college kid is just innocent, driving down the highway, coming home from college. I mean, he got stopped. He doesn't know why. He didn't do anything. He didn't consent. So for the most part, I'm at the mercy of the story that the officer wants to tell. And I've always felt that way. And I've always probed, how do you deal with the narrative authority that is given to the officer, that they then can turn around and write a report that substantiates the story they want to tell. And then to learn as I've grown that even officers, and even when you go to court and wrongful conviction issues arise and we recognize the documents were wrong and people told stories that were not true, it's an acceptable practice more than I would want it to be. That it's okay to lie depending on who you're lying about and what the goal is in terms of how you're telling this story. So, Carrie, you've been in this space because you're unique. Here you are, an officer talking about another officer, which muddies the narrative water. Can you kind of give us, what was that like to tell a story and you have the credibility of an officer, but somehow your story doesn't resonate while other stories are being lifted up as true? Can you walk us through some of that?
Okay, so here, you can help me answer your question.
Uh-oh.
So, as a police officer who randomly stopped somebody, any arrest, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But you look suspicious. You fit the description. You're black male, dark clothing, medium build. So, all right, I make up a story and you have to go to court on it. Now, how many jobs does that create within the justice system? Go ahead, we can start.
I'm thinking.
Got the police officer.
Yeah.
What else?
You got your clerks, right?
What else?
At the court.
Hmm.
Ooh,
Judges, lawyers.
lawyers, yeah.
You got the cleaners. You got the jails. Jail is the ultimate goal because that's the big house. But the point is, it creates so many jobs within the justice system. You think they want to stop that?
Wow.
They want to feed their kids. They want their kids to go to college. They feel like you're in this poor neighborhood, you're not gonna make it anyway.
Wow.
So, like right now, my son is in jail for murder and robbery. And I think it is really important for me to bring that up. My son didn't kill anybody. They know that. They have said that in court. But the point is, we're poor. So now they're saying, plea, plea, plea. And I'm saying, no, you're not. You are not going to take a plea for something that you didn't do.
Wow.
But the point is, the deck is stacked against us.
Wow.
Even though I have been a police officer, I have been fighting for the change. It's like you are in a situation to where you really don't have the voice. And for me, it's just another challenge. It's another way for me to create change. And that's what I plan on doing. But the point is, it creates jobs for a lot of people. That's the bottom line. You are a commodity. I am a commodity. Anyone living in the hood is a commodity. It's like when you get out of that space and you go to the suburbs, whatever, you have a better chance.
Wow.
But if you are in the hood, you're over policed and you are a commodity. They can't force us to pick cotton anymore. So now if you are poor, doesn't matter what color you are, if you are in the hood, you are a commodity.
Wow. So I almost just need to pause and
yes,
let that marinate. I know we're on the time, but that's one of the difficult things that these conversations probe is that we tell hard stories filled with trauma and pain, and the tendency of people to just want to extract the story for another agenda, right? So I want to acknowledge
why they're not giving me my back pay or anything, because they know that I would use it to be a great lawyer for my son. But to leave me in a situation to where I don't have the money, that is where they want to keep me. They don't want us to be able to fight. They want us to take pleas and to just dish out whatever, because after my son, it's going to be somebody else's son and somebody else's son and somebody else's son.
You bring up something, and I thank you so much for being willing to share that, because you resonate with me in a way that's very, I think, and Jamie, you can pick up here. In the movie Just Mercy, one of the things that movie does, Bryan Stevenson is having this conversation with this man on death row, and one of the things he says when he's trying to get his conviction overturned, and they're running into setbacks, and he encourages Bryan Stevenson. I think the character is Jamie Foxx that's playing this character, and he says, "Thank you, because you gave me my truth back. That I know that this system has done something to me, that nobody believes me, and there's no way I can clear myself." And even he articulates his own struggle with keeping the boundary between truth and fiction clear in his head, because the world has been organized around him to see him as only this criminal. And that's a hard moment, hard place to be in when you look at the world and the world continues to affirm something about you that's not true. And there's nowhere you can go to say this. So here we are, Jamie, you create an invisible institution to try to tell, or in the words of the Just Mercy, to try to give people the truth back, to help people to tell the truth. that's just so fragile for ears in the American context. Can you say some more? Because of course, that the invisible institution, who has the privilege to see it? Is it something that everyone can see if they look closely enough, or is it just a privileged purview of people in pain that we know racism and we know these issues, but no one else can penetrate what our experiences look like? Can you say something about that?
No, I love the way you framed the question. And I think one of the puzzles that my colleagues and I grapple with is that the realities that Carriol was describing, poor people basically as raw material for a set of these processes, and the narrative phenomena, the way power, whether it's the individual policeman or a city administration, exercises power through narrative. And the corollary of that is that the people who are on the other end of that process are not believed. Their reality is not recognized. They stand before the judge, and it's as if their tongue has been cut out, or people are speaking a foreign language. And I've had multiple, people, including men I'm writing about right now who were framed for murder, describe that moment where you're caught in this machinery, and nobody can hear your cries. But and again, I remind you, I'm speaking from the south side of Chicago. The thing that we need to grapple with is all of this is in plain sight, but we choose not to see it. Hence, your question about visibility and invisibility. We have ways of rendering invisible these realities. People create their own city by where they direct their attention as they move through the city. And that, I think, for me as a storyteller, that's the challenge. That's the thing we need to break through. We have all the information. It's not a matter of uncovering new information that's somehow gonna change. It's, I think, to go back to the title, The Unsolvable Problem, for me, the crux of that problem is our extraordinary ability to know things and not know them at the same time.
Wow.
And how do we, where's the fulcrum in storytelling, in civic activism that not forces people to see, but makes it just absolutely necessary for them to see what is available to be seen. It's not hidden. It's something that can be observed. And I'll give you an example so some years ago, in 2016, I did a series of articles based again to Carriol's role on whistleblowers within law enforcement, police officers who lost their jobs and mercilessly retaliated against, who were my sources for exposing a group of officers who were operating in one of the poorest, most abandoned public housing developments, and were essentially living off the drug trade. They were an integral part of the drug trade. It was a protection racket. They would target officers. They would target drug dealers who weren't cooperating with them, and other drug dealers would pay them off. And part of their practice was they would constantly frame people, put a package of drugs on to coerce cooperation. Where are the guns? Where's the money? Where are the drugs? Since those articles appeared in 2016, this has come to be regarded as the biggest single scandal in Chicago Police Department history. As of last week, there have been 169 exonerations of people who were framed by these officers. It's huge. And think about each of those people, each of those individuals had a family. Often the families were evicted from public housing because a family member had been evicted. So this is a human rights disaster at the center of the city in one of the poorest communities in the city. And it gets some attention from the press each time there are more exonerations.
Sure.
The way in which it is seen, though, is that, boy, that Sergeant Watts was a really, really, really bad guy. You know, the sergeant was a really, really bad guy. And there is no disposition on the part of the press, on the part of this whole thing is not part of our discourse about police reform or about public housing. It's treated as this isolated, boy, these were bad cops. This is at the center of our civic life. And in truth, activists haven't been involved. There's been great focus on the Laquan McDonald case to this day. But this, you know, this kind of oppression at the community level, imagine living under a regime of law enforcement like that. That's as repressive as any setting you can, where you walk out your door and a malign authority may grab you or grab your children. So again, in plain sight, massively reported on, and we don't get it. We don't understand it. We should be having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the center of our civic life, looking at this as a way of understanding the larger issues that it exemplifies. So we have lots of ways of knowing and not knowing at the same time.
Wow. I want to push, and then Carrie, I want you to jump back in on this point, because the story that y'all are describing, some people feel that, oh, this is an example of, you know, bad apples, maybe a bad department here or there, and trying to have a conversation that's authentic to the experience, but does not necessarily overly invest in broad strokes, is a dance that people who are working in reform try to do. But one of the things I think would maybe help us to frame, and I'm just speaking through the lens of the criminal justice issue, right? Because race is a whole nother, a larger issue that it's just hard to get your hands around. But criminal justice specifically, Sherilyn Ifill was giving a talk, and she helps to make the point that the way that policing post-Civil War was framed was in a response to the concerns of a people who wanted to know, what is public safety going to look like when we don't have control over those who were formerly enslaved the way we used to? And that the formulation of Black codes and the formulation of these laws creates a space where the thought process of public safety has already framed the Black body as a threat to public safety, and that the response of the public is to manage that body in a particular way, right? And that if that body's not managed in a particular way, it's a threat to the larger idea of safety. And the beginning, for me, it seems, and when I listen to officers like Carrie, when I listen to your stories, it consistently reminds me of how that narrative is still playing out. That how can we help an officer who shows up, who's been crafted in a way that public safety demands that they respond to that Black body in a particular way? And training is a thing. And here's where I want you to help me, Carrie, because I struggle with this one. Can you train someone to no longer see that Black body as a criminal? Now, it is. I don't mean it to be facetious. I'm seriously struggling with this, because the genesis of policing in that worldview where Black codes is a necessary response, it seems that we're still struggling with that. So even to the point where the latest video you see where two kids are fighting, a Black kid and a white kid, and then the officer shows up and they jump on the Black kid and arrest the Black kid and put their knee on his back, and the white kid sits on the couch. And I know, racial bias and some of these things are useful, but Carrie, help me. How can training help us? Or where is training? Where can it be useful? Or can it be useful? Or how do we think about it to deal or dig out some of these narrative junctures that we've held on to in terms of policing, public safety, and what do you do with Black bodies?
First of all, the first training you get is home training. We don't know what people are learning at home. So enslavement, it happened. Black codes, it happened. Segregation, it happened. Discrimination, it happened. Civil rights, it happened. Drugs, it happened. And then we have mass incarceration, it's happening. So through all of that, like you said, it was used to control us. You know, like I said before, you had public lynchings before. Now you have TV showing what is still a public lynching when you see police officers killing unarmed people. That is one reason why I did Carrio's Law. But with Carrio's Law, you can't make someone empathetic. You can't, you you cannot, you can do police training, which is basically to teach a police officer to be able to go home at night. It's not teaching them to love the community that they're working in. So they actually look at the community that they're working in as the enemy. Some of the officers that I worked with called it the jungle. Now I lived and worked in the same neighborhood, so you know, I don't know if they were referring to what, like Tarzan or something like that, or to say that Black people were savages or something like that. I'm not sure exactly, because I would hear it, but they wouldn't actually say it to me. But either way it goes, you cannot change someone's heart. You cannot. Someone has to want to. If they change, they want to change. You can't force that on them. You can't train them to change their hearts. And that was one thing that I realized. That is why I wrote a law, because I said, well, if they're not going to do it on their own, then a good officer can say, I'm not breaking the law for you. I'm not watching you kill somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why I felt like it had to be a law. That's what they're using against us, is laws. So I figured, well, I'll use one to help.
No,
And
that makes a lot of sense. And I want to lift this up, Carrie, and then Jimmy, piggyback, because I know we're time is moving, and I want to get some of your thoughts around some of the policy questions. So, Carrie, you gave me a good segue in terms of how you came to this law. But one of the things that that OTG, Open to Government, is doing is we're trying to figure out how to merge the experiential expertise of people who are close to pain, close to challenges, with policy expertise. So how do you solve it within an institution? How do you create accountability mechanisms to ensure that what you're doing is going to take root, that we can hold agencies accountable? But sometimes the policy doesn't make sense until you know the experiences of a people who the policies that are already there can't speak to. So for instance, no one would have thought, we need to create a law to tell officers to stop other officers from breaking the law, right? No, it would seem unfathomable that needs to be thought through, and yet your experience provides a window into something that without your experience we wouldn't be able to frame this way, right? And so that's one of the things that OTG is doing. But I want to push you a little to help us more think through what other things might be available to us through your lens, your experience. And I want to call it this way intentionally: experiential expertise, right? Because people are not just fumbling through the system. They create very sophisticated ways of trying to navigate pain and navigate injustice. And sometimes it's so disrespectful to walk into a space of people who have been targeted for pain for centuries and treat them as incompetent, that they don't know policy, they don't know how to respond, they don't know what to do, right? That's a challenge where people who are trying to enter the space have to deal with. But through your experiential expertise, how else, or what else do you think you could help us with? National Registry for sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. You've already said creating a space where officers have a responsibility to respond and intervene when someone other citizen is being assaulted or being their rights are being violated. Makes sense. Are there anything else that you could help us with coming out of your experience that people like myself who are thinking about it should start thinking more about in terms of what might can work?
Sure. It's common sense. If you're thirsty, what do you do?
If you're thirsty, I'm sorry. What did you say?
If you are thirsty, what do you do? What do you do?
You drink water.
Okay. If you're hungry, what do? You
get food.
If you don't want police officers beating on you, then what law do you use? You
Wow.
use Carrio's law.
Wow.
So that is how I looked at it.
Wow.
I said it has to be something that was common sense.
Wow.
And
Wow.
that is how you get the officers to respond. That's how you get anybody to respond. It's
Wow.
common sense.
Wow.
You don't need a rocket science. You don't have to be. We have a lot of educated fools. So I like what you said about the experience. So,
Hey,
expertise. I like that. I like that. I have to use that from now on. But
Please
the point is, before we had all of these degrees, people were using their common sense.
Right.
At least they should have anyway.
Right.
But now that you have this degree, people have these degrees, and I'm not knocking degrees at all. Don't get me wrong.
Please don't, because I got one. Please don't.
I haven't been able to focus long enough to complete mine. But the point is, you still have to use common sense.
Sure.
And out of all of these people with degrees, including yourself, it's like, why don't we have a solution?
Right.
Because people are greedy. They're looking to use the commodity to make money off of.
Right. So, Jamie, your experiential expertise, you walked with us and I'm saying us in terms of African Americans. I'm owning that I'm a part of that community in Chicago too, right? Even though it's North, I see that's my family, right? That's up South. You walk with people, live with them, broke bread with them, and now you see through your eyes things that, for whatever reason, others can't see. What policy ideas do you think one make common sense to bring in Carrier, right? Because sometimes it's not as tricky as we want it to be. And then what do you think we have the political capacity to possibly do, right? Which is a very different conversation between what we need, and yet we still need to do something to make some form of progress. So what would you offer those who are listening who can't benefit from your experience, but they can get a window into how your experience would help us to identify ideas that those on the outside of the experience can learn from and probably put energy and resources behind?
Well, the first thing I want to just underscore is your point about, what did you say? Experiential
expertise.
So nobody's got more expertise than the people who are most affected by
Right.
unconstitutional policing.
Right.
And we have so undervalued that expertise. We have so undervalued it. In a sense, I've spent my whole career attacking the disconnect between policy discourse and people's lived experience on the ground. It's possible to have a really distinguished career as a policy wonk, policy intellectual, without ever touching the ground, without ever testing your ideas against observable reality.
Right.
And there's a lot of Carriel's talking about the sort of element of profiteering in
right.
the systems of mass incarceration. There's a lot of profiteering in the sort of police accountability space. There's a lot of money to be had in developing oversight strategies and technologies, body cameras, and and I think giving a kind of priority and preferential standing to the lived experience of people who are most affected, and not in a condescending pat on the head way.
Right.
There are things to be learned about
Absolutely.
how this stuff works.
Absolutely.
And how it doesn't work.
Right.
And if you're not in that space, there are things that you can't see, can't know. So I just want to underscore the importance of that as we go forward in trying to create a more equitable, humane society.
Right.
The other thing that I would say in terms of policy is there are reasons why police abuse, police brutality has again and again been a kind of flashpoint in our history, bringing to the fore in this recurring way the fundamental bedrock unresolved issues around race. but it's a beachhead.
Mm.
It's not, there are so many institutional conditions that are implicated in the kind of abuses and the impunity enjoyed by abusers, that we cannot, there are important advances to be made in police reform. We cannot address what ails us in terms of race solely or exclusively or primarily through police reform.
Absolutely, right.
And
Absolutely.
I'll give you, maybe the clearest example of that is so much of our focus in the national discourse has been on rabidly racist officers. The notion that if a young African American is killed by the police, at the other end of the gun, there is necessarily a moral monster. And we have some examples.
Sure.
I think we all can make judgments about who Derek Chauvin is just on the basis of what we witnessed in the murder of George Floyd. But you could expel from law enforcement all such, proactive racists.
Right.
And young Black people would still be killed by the police.
Right.
And, and so we have to have a way of addressing a racist mode of law enforcement, as you say, that goes back to slave patrols, that goes back to Black codes, that's a continuous part of our history. And, again, thinking about this city with its hyper-segregation, there is a kind of geography of fear that governs how we police.
Wow.
And it's very hard to imagine training alone, as important as training is, that would change that reality. So we're challenged because we need to do everything we can do today to reduce the possibility or the likelihood of harms tomorrow. I think that's a moral obligation. We can't wait for some transformative moment. We need to do what we can do, and all sorts of things have been diagnosed, that are doable and mostly don't get done.
Sure.
But we also have to think about how we construct our own narrative, our own counter narrative that can take in all the conditions that contribute to the continuing kind of ravaging of Black communities, and often by officers who, I won't create a false equivalence by saying they're victims, but I've reported on a number of police shootings where the officer has been traumatized and oh my God, what just happened?
Right.
And actually was propelled there by policy and practice, not by individual racism.
Sure.
So anyway, I mean, I'm just trying to widen the frame a little bit.
No, that makes sense. And Carrie, feel free to chime back in on this, because I think one of the narrative deficits we have is we have a hard time talking about the agency of people who participate in the system and the choices the system provides them that may already be choices that are all deplorable for what we all want. So
let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. I mean, I think once you widen it to think about systems, you and this is what Truth and Reconciliation does at its best, is there's actually an element of human sympathy for different actors in the system. So, I made reference before to this ongoing so-called Watts scandal in Chicago and all the exonerations. Well, in case after case after case, an indigent individual who's been arrested on mostly a drug charge, occasional gun charge, would tell a public defender, I've been framed. Everybody knows those cops are dirty. They've been doing this for years. I've been framed. This is unjust.
Right.
The public defender looks at the person's criminal record. It's hard to come up in one of these communities, certainly in public housing.
Right, without something.
And looks at the amount of weight that the officers put on the individual. And this might be the most, think Brian Stevenson. This might be the most conscientious criminal defense lawyer. Who's going to say, it's your choice, but I have to tell you, if you don't plead guilty, if you don't take a plea, you're taking a risk of going away for a very, very long time. Now, that's somebody who's caught in a system where conditions that they don't control are constraining and dictating their choices. There are ways in which many police officers are entangled in much the same way. And until we can begin to describe how that system, impinges on the agency of all sorts of people, I mean, above all, the folks on the ground who are oppressed, it's hard to make progress. It seems to me that we just kind of bolt on reforms of various sorts that don't really alter the fundamental machinery.
Yeah. So, I mean, Carrie, where and I don't know, how is the law that you're proposing? How are people in groups responding to it? Where is it? I know you said that it's made some progress, maybe not as much as what we would want. Can you tell us a little more about how? Because this is a very, I think, common sense reform that's rooted in experiential expertise that makes sense. It doesn't take a rocket science to see the validity and the good that's added by that law. Where is it in terms of what's it doing? What kind of opposition is it having? Is it getting a lot of support? Can you talk to us a little bit about the context surrounding the Carrio's law? Okay.
Let me just start off by saying what a journalist friend has said to me. He said 20% of the officers are bad, 20% are good, and it's the 60% in between that's the problem, because they do hear, see, and hear, see, and say any evil, or hear, see. Well, you know what I mean. Speak any evil against what's going on.
Right.
So that would pretty much make 80% of the officers bad if that's the case, right? Because so for me, to write the law, I knew that I couldn't change the hearts of officers, but for that 60% in between who could do and say nothing, it gave them leverage to where they can say to the bad officers, "Nah, I'm not going to jail for you. I'm not going to do that." Wow. So you do have good officers, and you do just have a few that are bad. In my case, the officer, like I said earlier, he eventually went to jail. He went to jail when he and two other officers stopped 4 teenage boys, and one of the officers was accused of shooting the boy with the BB gun, but he got off. 2 of the officers got off. The officer that I had an issue with, he wound up going to jail. So anyway, I went to that trial.
For the same thing you said he did with you, or in your presence. Wow.
Exactly.
Right.
So one of the officers that did get off, the one that was accused of shooting the boy with the BB gun, he was the same officer that was the detective to investigate the case for my son. So it's like you are still on the job after being accused, and then he has 2 police brutality complaints in his file.
Wow.
So it's like trying to change the system. It's like I keep having opposition, because although I am trying to do it for the right reasons, they promote these bad officers, and they continue to cover up what's going on. And then because they had someone help them cover up, then, and as they move to the top, they're covering up things that happen at the at the officer level.
Wow.
So I think that this law, you asked me about opposition. That's some of the opposition.
That makes sense.
Because the people who are who it's meant to get rid of, they're getting promoted. So I basically just need to keep pushing. And I just
Wow.
need people like you to keep pushing, people that are listening to keep pushing. We
Wow.
have to push these laws that will help create change. And
Right.
as far as any stories, like we were talking about earlier, when I first started college, the criminal justice instructor said that in the criminal justice system, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong, it's who has the best story. And in some cases, they have the best story.
That has absolutely been my experience from watching it. I'll say this, and then definitely, Jamie, I want to see your feedback on this. And maybe I can tell it this way. So there's this. I remember being in an interview for a job, and it was a racial justice job, and they were interviewing me, and I'm giving them my my little credentials. I've been doing this work, I've been fighting, I've been trying, I've been marching, I've been I've done all these things. And then they said something, and they asked me, well, tell us, your background sounds good, but like, what have you accomplished, right? Like, what have you been able to deliver, right? And the question was so, to me, out of tone, because I wanted to suggest, when you start hiring and think about people to fight for justice, you might need to ask, what have you lost fighting? How many jobs did you not get? How many promotions did you not get? Right? Like, the story we tell somehow or another consistently puts the burden on people like Cario, and the burden on people who are close to the pain, to then try to prove some kind of way, right, that they're doing it, is making progress, is going forward. And so as we are working to tell these stories and trying to work through, Jamie, what do you think? What kind of stories do we need to be telling? Does that make sense? Because
yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and
yeah.
it's one that I wake up thinking about every day, as you might imagine.
Mm.
And I mean, I've been compared to where I started in my career doing this kind of reporting, my work has now been widely acknowledged, and that's gratifying. It's also troubling.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, I don't mean this in a grateful way, but because I worry that a certain kind of narrative journalism that I and others practice may contribute to the status quo, may contribute to how things stay the same.
Wow.
Because I can write a story, or my colleagues, who do this kind of work, we can do stories that are well reported, and I hope well written, that can have the effect of moving people without moving them. They can have the effect of arousing people to sympathy, to outrage, but not actually moving them. That it can be kind of a closed loop where people feel like, oh, that's terrible, and I'm aroused, and my humanity is confirmed by my ability to respond to somebody else's pain. But I'm actually not moved to it at the level of my identity, my being. It doesn't propel me to do anything in the world. So there's a kind of self-satisfied thing that I often worry that my reporting can feed into. So I think, for me, and I sort of alluded to this before, part of the challenge is to be able to tell a rich and a complex and a compelling story that the reader or viewer, depending on the medium, finds themselves inside of.
Right.
That you can't just be a spectator or a connoisseur of literary journalism.
Right.
You are in this story, and this story has implications for you. And I think those are the stories we need to tell. We are in this together. We are lost in this society that we can't see, that's so resistant to change. We are in this together. And so anyway, in terms of my practice,
Sure.
that's the story that I haven't broken, but I think about
Well,
figuring out how to tell every day.
keep working on it. Well, listen, I know the time is short. Thank you all so much for being with us. I don't want to go over, disrespect your time. Thank you so much. I commend both of you. I celebrate you. In spirit, I'm with you, right? Encouraging you to keep going, and please feel free to reach out to OTG and other organizations that we want to help, and we want to be with you in this fight, because it is our fight. It's a collective fight. But to both of you, be well, and thank you so much for sharing your experiential expertise with us on this evening.
And thank you for giving us a new term.
Awesome.
We'll put it on our resumes.
All right. All right. Awesome. Well, I think they're going to cut us off. Thank y'all so much.